Hi, I'm Dong. Welcome to Digging into China, where we explore China in depth to review unique perspectives. The U.S. China trade war, now 4 months in, has been a turbulent journey. At its height, opinions swirled. Some claimed China was prevailing, others argued the United States held the upper hand. The intensity of the conflict fueled passionate debates, with emotions often clouding judgment. As time has progressed, and with nations like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and the European Union reaching tariff agreements with the U.S., it appears the trade war is entering a new phase. Today, 4 months later, we will revisit the U.S.-China trade war and explore the question of who is winning and who is losing. First, allow me to clarify a key point about the U.S.-China trade war. When I speak of winning or losing, I consider two distinct aspects: how effectively the fight is being waged and whether ultimate victory is achievable. These are separate considerations. Take Ukraine, for instance. It may not defeat Russia or reclaim its eastern territories, but that does not mean it has fought poorly. Such an outcome reflects the realities of its circumstances. Before its war, Ukraine ranked in the 20th globally in military strength and was a peripheral nation, not widely recognized as a democratic state. Its democracy index ranked below Singapore's, often categorized as a semi-authoritarian, small and impoverished country. Yet, through the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine captured global attention, secured substantial aid, and challenged Russia, the world's second-ranked military power, while earning a place among democratic nations. Given its achievements, what more could be expected? Ukraine has fought with remarkable resolve. This is what I mean by fighting well, regardless of the final outcome. For President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, even if Kiev were to fall tomorrow, they could still claim to have fought admirably. The U.S.-China trade war shares some parallels. Beyond the overarching question of who wins or loses, there is the matter of how skillfully the battle is being fought. Has the Chinese Communist Party performed well in this regard? In my assessment, it has not. Indeed, I would argue it has made frequent missteps. The trade war can be divided into two phases. The first phase spanned from the April 2nd, when the Liberation Day tariff was announced, to May 14 during the U.S.-China Geneva negotiations. On April 2nd, Trump stunned the world by announcing tariffs on numerous countries. In retrospect, it is evident that Trump's tariffs fall into two categories: scare tactic tariffs and substantive tariffs. Scare tactic tariffs are those initially proposed, such as the 46% tariff on Vietnam, the 36% tariff on China, or the 100% tariffs threatened against Canada and Mexico before Liberation Day. Later, Trump mentioned the 30% tariffs on the EU, and as of today, he has proposed 50% tariffs on Brazil, 35% on Canada, 50% on India, and 20% on Taiwan. These are scare tactic tariffs, unlikely to be implemented or, if enacted, sustained for long. They are not the final tariff levels. The purpose of these tariffs is to exert pressure, compelling other nations to negotiate with Trump. Substantive tariffs, by contrast, are those in recent agreements, such as the 15% tariffs with the EU, Japan, and South Korea, or the 20% tariff with Vietnam. These are the tangible results of negotiations, not unilateral threats, and are the tariffs that take effect. Recognizing this distinction highlights the CCP's first significant error. At the outset, it failed to differentiate between scare tactic and substantive tariffs. Reflecting on Trump's April 2nd Liberation Day announcement, it was a broad salvo of scare tactic tariffs designed to create panic and drive nations to the negotiation table. No country that has since reached a deal with the U.S. faces tariffs higher than those announced on April 2nd. In fact, shortly after, Trump scaled back the tariffs to a uniform 10% and delayed their implementation until now. Clearly, on April 2nd, the CCP misread U.S. intentions. China was not even the country facing the highest tariffs. Many others were targeted with the steeper rates. One might say Trump's tariff figures were arbitrary. Yet, the CCP was the only one to retaliate, or rather, the only one to take the tariffs seriously. The result? A mutual escalation, with tariffs reaching 145% on one side and 125% on the other, creating an awkward standoff. In my view, the true consequences was that China became a focal point. The U.S. immediately shifted its attention to China. I'm not suggesting it was wrong to counter Trump's trade war or that China should passively accept U.S. tariffs. China has every right to respond. However, we must consider what that response accomplished. By retaliating alone on April 2nd, did China not simply make itself a target? Unlike Biden, Trump does not adhere strongly to democratic ideals, and the US and China are not inevitably adversaries. Consider Trump's relatively amicable ties with Russia recently. China's April 2nd retaliation positioned it as Trump's primary foe. The CCP's response suggests two possibilities. Either it was disorganized and the retaliation was an impulsive miscalculation that drew attention to China, or it was part of a grander strategy to seize the moment of Trump's tariff outburst to rally global support for free trade against the US. If the former, it was a grave error, a severe misjudgment of Trump's intentions or his governing style. The CCP should have the teams analyzing Trump's behavior, and any thorough study would reveal his use of scare tactics. This is not new. It has been Trump's approach since his business days. He makes an outrageous demand to lower expectations and force compromises. This is Trump's art of the deal. For instance, when sued by New York City for illegal development, Trump countersued for $100 million, knowing the figure was unrealistic, perhaps even fabricated. His aim was to pressure the other side, lower their expectations, and push for negotiations. The Liberation Day tariff followed this pattern precisely. Moreover, Trump had already threatened Mexico and Canada before April 2nd. Ordinary people uninvolved in politics might miss this, but the CCP should not. They should have recognized that the Liberation Day tariffs were a scare tactic to draw countries into negotiations with the US. To secure a favorable outcome, the CCP should have understood, based on Trump's history, that quiet negotiations were wiser than public confrontation. That would have been the optimal approach. After all, Trump's tariffs targeted multiple countries, not just China. China could have let the EU take the lead and absorb the initial scrutiny. Some might argue there is another possibility that the CCP was playing a larger game. Did they not leverage their rare earth resources in the first round, striking back and pressuring the US? Could this not be seen as securing a stronger position for future talks, demonstrating strength, enhancing China's global image, and rallying others against the US? This leads us to the second phase of the trade war. From the May 14 Geneva negotiations to the present, during this period, the trade war appeared to cool, with no new tariffs imposed, resulting in less media coverage and public attention. However, this phase of strategic maneuvering is arguably more critical than the first. The key issue: who can secure more allies? The U.S.-China confrontation is not merely a bilateral contest. For China to prevail, restricting U.S. access to rare earth is insufficient, just as U.S. tariffs or chip restrictions alone cannot ensure victory. Even Zelensky understood that after defending Kiev, he needed to build global momentum, positioning himself as a champion of democracy to rally allies against Russia. If the CCP's first phase retaliation was not impulsive, then in this second phase, to defeat the US, the focus during the truce should have been uniting other nations against US tariffs. Yet, the CCP was woefully unprepared, and the results have been disastrous. After the April 2nd tariffs, China held the moral high ground, appearing resolute against an unpredictable Trump. His global tariffs, whether beneficial to the US or not, were morally questionable to Western and global South nations. Trump was alienating allies, giving China, a rare occurrence for an authoritarian state, a chance to claim moral superiority. This was a unique opportunity to champion free trade. Did the CCP seize it in the second phase? They made an attempt, but it was clearly inadequate, more a reactive patch-up than a deliberate effort. Who did the CCP need to align with? Traditional Western powers like Japan, South Korea, and the EU. China's largest markets outside the US, and ASEAN nations like Vietnam, critical for transshipment trade. Ideally, these countries would align with China, reject US deals, and join a trade war against America. At a minimum, China needed allies like Vietnam to stand with it, providing a fallback for transshipment exports to the US under high tariffs. The reality? A complete failure. Efforts to unite Japan, the EU, or Vietnam against the US fell flat. During the truce, the US secured agreements with Japan, the EU, South Korea, UK, and others, including Vietnam, China's key transshipment partner. The US now imposes a 20% tariff on Vietnam, which in turn monitors transshipment goods and levels a 40% tariff. Who are these measures targeting? Clearly, China. Some might blame these countries for lacking resolve, but I disagree. The CCP failed to offer sufficient sincerity. Early in the tariff war, EU officials were open to discussions with China, preferring to explore options with China before aligning with the US against Trump's aggression. The EU presented 4 demands: Chinese investment in Europe, reduced product dumping, human rights, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Apart from human rights, which is somewhat routine, the others were practical and negotiable. Yet, the CCP agreed only to invest in Europe and offered vague commitments on dumping. The third and the fourth demands were outright rejected. Media reports suggest that during Foreign Minister Wang Yi's Europe visit, his demeanor was uncooperative. EU officials described the negotiations with Wang as akin to being lectured, with him fixated on justifying China's support for Russia. For Chinese audiences, this patronizing style is familiar. Such talks could not yield positive outcomes, let alone a China-EU alliance against the US. The EU's initial hesitation to align with the US stemmed from a desire to explore China's offer. They were open to setting aside ideological differences to counter the US trade war if China showed enough commitment. But after talks, they chose the lesser evil, aligning with the US and abandoning hopes for China. The same applies to neighbors like Japan. The CCP made efforts such as softening criticism of Japan's nuclear wastewater and lifting bans on Japanese seafood and fruit. Yet these gestures did not prevent Japan from leaning towards the US. The CCP's sincerity was plainly insufficient. Some may argue the EU's demands were excessive, that China's support for Russia is strategically necessary, or that Japan was ungrateful. But the world does not accommodate every desire. Trump seeks US economic revival and debt reduction, even relinquishing global leadership and democratic ideals. Did the CCP not anticipate that the rallying allies against US tariffs would require sacrifices when it retaliated? This is why I believe the initial response was more impulsive than strategic. If it was planned, diplomatic preparations and concessions should have been ready. After engaging the U.S., the CCP should have been prepared to meet Europe's demands, even if it meant distancing from Russia or adjusting production, particularly for electric vehicles. To mend ties with Japan, they should have curbed anti-Japanese sentiment online, banned inflammatory content like Nanjing photo studios or film like Dongji Island. The CCP could do this. Anti-Japanese sentiment is within their control. Lifting the Korea ban could have prevented South Korea from aligning with the U.S. After the trade war began, Europe, Japan, and South Korea offered openings. Japan's Prime Minister Ishiba and South Korea's President Lee are relatively pro-China figures. The CCP could have secured better outcomes but failed to capitalize. Alternative, if unprepared to meet the EU, Japan, or South Korea's conditions, China should not have retaliated. By holding back and letting the EU lead, China could have gained leverage in EU negotiations, even with the later attempts to unite others against the US. The efforts seem improvised, lacking preparation and sincerity. Even if the first phase's retaliation was rash, the second phase offered a chance to recover by increasing offers. After all, is it not a matter of Xi Jinping's decision? As with the COVID reopening, Xi spoke and it happened. Yet, Xi lacks such resolve. He has ambition but not courage. Trump's global tariff presented an opportunity. If Xi had Deng Xiaoping's boldness, unafraid of domestic criticism or foreign capital, he would have opened the markets, suppressed nationalism, and courted nations like Japan, South Korea, Europe, Taiwan, or India. Short term, this might threaten the CCP's rule by removing external enemies and the nationalist outlets. But a successful anti-U.S. tariff alliance could have bolstered the CCP's legitimacy for decades, like Deng Xiaoping, who opened the discourse and grew the economy, risking short-term instability for long-term stability. Xi lacks such courage. Reviewing the timeline on April 2nd, Trump's Liberation Day tariff sparked the conflict. The CCP retaliated and the trade war began. By May 14, the Geneva negotiations paused hostilities. The first phase, this appears impulsive, unprepared for either severing U.S. ties or leading an anti-U.S. coalition. From May 14, during the truth, both sides maneuvered diplomatically to win allies. The second phase, this was an opportunity to correct the first phase's impulsiveness by offering better terms to the EU, Japan, and South Korea. The CCP failed. By August 1st, as Japan, South Korea, and the EU reached U.S. agreements, China was isolated. I do not argue that China should not counter U.S. tariffs. Retaliation or restraint each has its strategy. The April 2nd response was not inherently wrong. The issue is how well China fought afterwards. So far, it has been an uneven effort, but the consequences will not be immediate as the trade war continues. A third phase likely awaits, where the U.S., after securing deals with others, renegotiates with China. China's current tariffs, including Liberation Day and the fentanyl tariffs, total roughly 55%. These are not final, but the scare tactic tariffs turned substantive due to China's retaliation. The final terms are unclear. The CCP may retaliate again, but its leverage will be weaker than on April 2nd, a result of earlier missteps. The failures of the first and the second phase will manifest in the third, in the terms of the final agreements. As the U.S. secures deals with the Western nations and Vietnam, China's negotiation position weakens. Even the tariff war pauses, like Geneva or recent Stockholm talks, were strategic errors for the CCP. These pauses gave the U.S. time to secure deals with others, reducing China's chances for a favorable outcome. Fighting well and winning are distinct. Ukraine fought admirably, but given the power disparity, struggles to secure victory. The U.S. China trade war may follow suit. The final tariff agreements between Trump and Xi is uncertain, likely lower tariffs and increased Chinese purchases of U.S. goods. But will this be effective? I have doubts. China's greatest asset is its diligent, resilient workforce, unmatched by the U.S. Claims of returning manufacturing to America overlook who will undertake the labor. Tariffs alone cannot address this. Even if the CCP's diplomatic failures yield an unfavorable deal, they can absorb tariffs by squeezing Chinese workers, maintaining low-profit exports to undercut U.S. manufacturing. If the U.S. seeks to curb Chinese dumping rather than 50% tariffs or demanding $500 billion in soybean purchases, enforcing China's labor law would be more effective. Trump, however, seems to lack this perspective. If the trade war continues this way, China may not lose, but the U.S. may not win either. The cost of China's resilience, a harder life, and the lower wages for its people. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my video to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.